The dealer said it with the particular confidence of a man who has never been wrong in front of an audience. He was standing in front of his Fendt Farmer 5S, clean, green, everything new and gleaming in the October morning light, and he was addressing the crowd of perhaps 30 Bavarian farmers who had come to the Untermus demonstration day with their muddy boots and their folded arms and their careful, quiet attention. He had a name, Klaus Bergman. He was 37 years old, and he had been selling modern tractors in this valley for 9 years, and he was good at it. He understood the farmers. He knew how to speak to them in a way that respected them without losing his professional edge. He had done this 100 times. But this time, standing at the edge of the Kreuzberg field on a cold October morning, with the season's first hard frost still visible on the north-facing hedgerow, he made a mistake. He made it looking directly at Georg Huber. "Gentlemen," he said, "this field is the one your grandfathers broke their machines on. Heavy clay, 9% grade this time of year." He gestured at the Fendt. 48 horsepower, hydraulic draft control, modern full-coverage tires. This machine was built for exactly this. He paused. He let his eyes pass across the crowd. Then they found Georg Huber, who was standing slightly apart from the others at the field edge, one hand resting on the hood of his Lanz Bulldog HR6, dark, red-wheeled, the paint worn to something between navy and iron by 21 seasons of Bavarian fieldwork. "Some of you," Bergman said, with a smile that he likely did not mean to be unkind, "are still using machines that should have retired before your children were born. And I say this with respect," the smile, "because no old Lance is going to keep up with what you're about to see." There was a sound from the crowd, not quite laughter, something between laughter and recognition. Georg Huber looked at his tractor. He looked at the field. He said nothing. If this is the first story you have heard on this channel, subscribe now and hit the bell. New story every single day. This one is not about tractors. Let me tell you about Georg Huber, and about the Kreuzberg field, and about the specific kind of knowledge that can only be built from 21 years of plowing the same clay. Georg was 59 years old. He had been farming the valley's eastern parcel since 1948, when his father had handed him the farm with the specific instruction that they could not afford new machinery until the mortgage was clear, and that, in the meantime, they would make do. They had made do with a Lanz Bulldog HR6 that his father had bought second-hand in 1946, a machine that was already 7 years old when Georg first drove it, that had been through the war years on some other farm, and had its own scars and its own dispositions, which Georg had learned the way you learn the dispositions of anything you live with closely for a long time. He had come to the demonstration day for one reason. His son Werner had been pressing him for 2 years about replacing the Lance, and he had decided to come and look at what the new machines actually did before making any decision. He had not come to argue. He was a man who believed that evidence should precede opinion, and he had driven the Lance to the demonstration field on the road from his farm, because it was the most natural thing in the world to bring the machine he knew to the place where the comparison would be made. The Lance had drawn looks all morning. This was not new. The Lance had been drawing looks for 21 years, and the looks had always contained the same components: the age of the thing, the weight of it, the particular darkness of its body that comes from iron that has been cleaned and oiled and used and cleaned again rather than painted, and the sound, that single, deliberate pom-pom-pom that was nothing like any other engine anyone had built in the last 30 years. Bergman had made his assessment of Georg Huber when he arrived. Good farmer, probably capable, clearly not a customer today, probably not a customer for the next decade unless something changed. This assessment was accurate in most of its details and incorrect in the one that mattered. When Bergman made his remark about old Lance machines, Georg had understood exactly what the man was doing and why. He had filed it in the part of his mind that held information rather than the part that felt things, and he had looked at the field. He looked at it carefully. The Kreuzberg field was a piece of heavy clay he knew completely, not abstractly but fully, in every corner and every variation. He knew how this clay behaved in October when the summer had been wet, and the top layer had dried to a crust over the deeper wet clay beneath. He knew what it did to plowshares under full load. He knew how the resistance changed across the field width. He knew that the first furrow across the full width would be the hardest because the crust was undisturbed. He also knew something about the Fendt Farmer 5S that Bergman did not seem to consider relevant. After the remark, he waited for Bergman to finish. Then he said, "I would be interested in a comparison." Bergman looked at him with the expression of a man who had been given an unexpected gift. "By all means," he said. The farmers formed two loose groups, one near the Fendt, which gathered the young and the curious, and one near the Lanz, which gathered the old and the watchful. The cooperative secretary was appointed as informal judge. The terms were simple. Both machines would plow a full width of the Kreuzberg field at the same set plow depth. The furrow quality and depth would be assessed at completion. Bergman agreed with the specific enthusiasm of a man who cannot imagine losing. Georg nodded. He walked to the lance and took the blowtorch from its bracket. "Now let me tell you what Georg Huber understood about heavy clay and about hydraulic draft control that made this comparison less even than Bergman believed. Because this is the mechanical truth the rest of this story rests on. The Fendt Farmer 5S was a genuinely impressive machine. 48 horsepower, modern hydraulic system, excellent weight distribution. Bergman's presentation had not been dishonest. In most conditions, the Fendt would outperform the Lanz. But the Kreuzberg field was not most conditions. The Kreuzberg field in October, with a dried surface crust over wet heavy clay, was a specific and demanding condition that the Fendt's most advanced feature was precisely designed to handle, and in handling it would work against itself. The hydraulic draft control on the Fendt Farmer 5S was designed to prevent the tractor from overloading. When the plow encountered high resistance, more than the system considered safe, the hydraulics would automatically raise the plow slightly, reducing the working depth to protect the tractor from excessive strain. This was excellent engineering. In general field conditions, it was a genuine improvement. It prevented damage. It saved fuel. But on the Kreuzberg clay, where the crust resistance was high throughout the entire pass, and the clay below was so heavy that even partial plow depth encountered significant resistance, the hydraulic draft control would spend the entire furrow fighting to maintain depth against a system that kept trying to lift the plow out of it. The result would be a shallow furrow, not from lack of power, but because the automated safety system would interpret the consistent high resistance as a signal to protect the machine, and protection meant shallower plowing. The Lanz Bulldog HR6 had no hydraulic draft control. It had no automatic systems of any kind. Its plow hook was a direct mechanical connection. When Georg set the plow depth, it stayed there. When the clay pushed back, the single cylinder fired, the flywheel absorbed the resistance, and the plow went through at the depth it had been set to. The Lanz did not protect itself. It did not calculate. It pulled at the depth Georg told it to pull at. And if the clay was harder than expected, the flywheel carried the extra resistance between strokes without the plow changing depth. This was not because the Lanz was better engineered than the Fendt. It was because the Lanz was simpler. 21 years on the Kreuzberg field had taught Georg that the one thing heavy October clay rewarded was consistency. Consistent depth. Consistent pull. No self-adjustments, no protective systems, no automation deciding on his behalf that the conditions were too difficult. Georg had known this before he arrived. He had known it from the moment Bergman mentioned the field by name. Subscribe now if you haven't, and stay with this story. Because what happens on the Kreuzberg field in the next 2 hours is why this valley talked about Georg Huber for the rest of his life. He heated the glue cop for 8 minutes. The farmers watched. Bergman watched with the patient courtesy of a man who is not threatened. The blowtorch applied to the cast-iron hot bulb chamber at the base of the engine was a slow process. The iron absorbed the heat reluctantly in October morning air just above freezing. Georg held the torch steady and waited. He had done this 10,000 times. He knew the color he was waiting for. 8 minutes, the color arrived. He set the blowtorch aside. He took the starting crank, heavy iron, the handle worn smooth in the exact shape of his grip from 21 years of exactly this motion, and inserted it into the crankshaft fitting. He turned it once. The flywheel moved. He turned it again, his full weight behind the rotation. He turned it a third time. The engine fired. Pum! The sound went across the field, and the farmers went quiet in the specific way that people go quiet when they hear something that is older than the world they are standing in. The Fendt's engine had started with a key, clean and immediate. The Lanz's engine had arrived. There is a difference between a machine that starts and a machine that arrives, and the farmers standing at the Kreuzberg field in October of 1969 felt the difference in their feet through the ground before they heard it in the air. Pum! 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 1 beat per second. The exhaust pipe above the engine sent its dark smoke into the gray October morning. The frame of the tractor settled into its vibration. Bergman said nothing. He had done this long enough to know that the farmers watching would notice if he responded to an old tractor's starting sequence with the wrong kind of smile. Georg Huber climbed onto the open seat. He checked the plow setting one final time. He looked at the field. He engaged the clutch. The Fendt went first. It was an impressive machine in motion. The engine smooth and powerful, the hydraulics responsive, the tires maintaining good contact with the wet clay. The first 30 meters were excellent. The Fendt's plow cut cleanly into the Kreuzberg clay at full depth, the wet soil turning up in proper furrow slices. Then the clay changed. At approximately 30 meters, the plow entered the heaviest section. The resistance increased. The hydraulic draft control registered the increase and began its calculation. The plow rose fractionally 3-4 centimeters to reduce the load. The Fendt continued plowing. It continued beautifully. It continued efficiently. But it was plowing at 15 centimeters where the contract had said 20. The farmers watching at the field edge had their arms folded. Several of them had been plowing this field for years. They watched the furrow slice, and they knew what they were seeing. A machine that had decided the clay was too hard and had adjusted its own decision accordingly. Bergman had not plowed this field before. The Fendt had done what it was designed to do and had done it correctly by its own criteria. At the far end, he turned and came back to the starting point. The cooperative secretary measured. He wrote down his numbers without showing them to anyone. Georg Huber drove the Lanz to the start of the second furrow. He had set the plow depth at home, walking the edge of the field before the demonstration began. He had put his boot into the clay at 3 or 4 points along the planned furrow line and understood the resistance. He knew what the clay would do. He set the plow accordingly. He engaged the clutch. Pum pum pum. 1 beat per second, the plow went in. At 30 meters where the Fendt's draft control had lifted its plow, the Lanz encountered the same resistance. The single cylinder fired. The flywheel absorbed the load. The engine note dropped perhaps 20 RPM. The dark smoke above the exhaust pipe thickened slightly, the engine working harder, the flywheel storing more energy in each stroke. The plow did not move upward. Not by a centimeter. The plow stayed at the depth Georg had set it, and the flywheel kept turning, and the clay kept resisting, and the Lanz kept pulling at the same steady beat it had been pulling at since the first firing stroke. Pum pum pum. The farmers at the field edge had uncrossed their arms. At 50 meters, Georg was still at full plow depth. The furrow behind the Lanz was rougher than the Fendt's first 30 meters, the clay coming up in heavier pieces because the plow was going deeper and taking more of it. But it was deep. It was at the depth the field required for proper seedbed preparation, the depth that the Kreuzberg clay needed to be turned if the winter preparation was going to work. The farmers knew this. Several had stopped talking entirely. Bergman was watching from the field edge. He was watching the smoke above the exhaust pipe. He was watching the furrow the machine was leaving. He had the expression of a professional man registering information that does not fit his current understanding and beginning the process of revising it. The lance crossed the full width of the field. The plow came out at the far end. Georg Huber turned the machine and drove back to the starting point without hurrying. The cooperative secretary measured. He compared his two sets of numbers. He showed them to Bergman first by convention and then read them aloud to the farmers. The fence furrow, average depth 14.3 centimeters. The lance's furrow, average depth 19.8 centimeters. The agreed specification, 20 centimeters. The farmers were quiet for several seconds. Then one of them, an older man named Ritter who had been farming the valley since before the war, said, clearly and without cruelty, "The Fendt plowed where it wanted to plow. The Lanz plowed where the man told it to plow." There was a sound from the crowd. This time it was not laughter. Bergman came to Georg at the field edge, when the crowd had dispersed toward the refreshment table. "Huber," he said. Georg was cleaning the plowshare with a rag from his coat pocket. "The draft control," Bergman said. He had understood the mechanism as soon as Ritter had spoken, and the understanding had arrived with the specific discomfort of a professional man recognizing that he had made a claim in front of 30 customers, that the field had just disproved in front of the same 30 customers. "Yes," Georg said. "In this specific clay, at this time of year, the resistance is consistent enough that the system reads it as overload rather than normal conditions. It reduces depth to protect the machine. In lighter soils or softer conditions, it would not do this." "In lighter soils," Georg said, "the old lance would also not have an advantage." He folded the rag. "But this is not a lighter soil." Bergman was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known that the draft control would behave this way in this field?" Georg looked at the two furrows running parallel across the clay, one shallower and cleaner, one deeper and more effortful. "Since I read about the draft control system 3 years ago," he said. "I did not know it was on the Fendt Farmer 5S specifically until this morning when you described the machine. But the principle is the same on all of them. A system that protects the tractor from high resistance will always plow shallow and heavy clay, because the clay's resistance is what it is protecting against. And you came today knowing this." "I came today to look at new machines," Georg said, "because my son wants me to replace the lance." He looked at the old machine, dark, red-wheeled, the exhaust pipe still warm. "But when you said what you said, I thought it was worth showing." Bergman looked at the lance for a long time. He looked at the furrow it had left. "In the right conditions," he said carefully, "the Fendt is still the better machine." "In most conditions," Georg said, "you are probably right." He climbed onto the lance. "But farming is not done in most conditions. It is done in the specific conditions of each field on each day. That is why the man who has plowed the same field for 20 years knows something the machine does not." He engaged the clutch and drove the lance off the field. Pum pum pum. Hit subscribe. New story every single day. The Kreuzberg demonstration was talked about in the valley for years afterward. Not as a story about Lanz Bulldog specifically, and not as a story about Fendt tractors. The farmers who told it as a story about what a field knows and what a machine knows, and which one is more likely to be right about the specific condition of the soil on a given morning in October. Werner Huber did not stop pressing his father about the lance. He continued for several years, and his father continued to listen without committing, and the lance continued to do the work it had always done. In 1976, A hydraulic component failure on a neighbor's modern tractor in the middle of autumn plowing season brought Georg and the Lanz to the neighbor's field on 3 consecutive days to complete the work. The neighbor paid for the diesel. When Georg Huber died in 1981 at the age of 71, his son Werner found a letter among the farm papers in the barn office. It was from Bergman, dated October 1969, written 3 days after the demonstration. It said, "I spoke without thinking clearly this morning about old iron and what it can do. The field answered better than I could have. Respect to the machine and to the man who understood it." Werner had not known the letter existed. He read it twice in the cold barn, with the Lanz standing behind him in the near dark. He kept the letter. He also kept the Lanz. Pum pum pum. Some machines survive not because they are best, but because they are honest. The Lanz Bulldog asked nothing of the clay but to pull through it. No calculations, no protections, no adjustments made on behalf of the machine's own comfort. You set the depth and it held the depth, and the flywheel did the work between strokes, and if the clay was hard, then the clay was hard and the plow went through it anyway. The Fendt Farmer 5S was a better tractor by almost any objective measure. Bergman had been telling the truth. What he had not understood was that the field had been built for something older than any measure he was using. Some places remember what they were plowed with first. The Kreuzberg clay remembered. And when a quiet farmer climbed onto an old dark machine on a cold October morning and proved to 30 watching men that the deepest furrow came from the simplest system, from iron and flywheel, and a man who knew the ground, what the watching men remembered afterward was not the depth of the furrow. What they remembered was the sound. Pum pum pum. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. Old iron doing what old iron was built to do. Exactly where it was told.